The morning of June 6, 1944 broke grey and cold over the English Channel, but for a select group of German tank commanders positioned in fortified positions overlooking Omaha Beach, the weather was irrelevant. What mattered was what they were about to witness, an amphibious assault that would fundamentally shatter their understanding of American military capability and force a recalculation of everything they believed about warfare itself. At precisely 0600 hours, the first waves of American assault troops began their descent down the cargo nets of transport ships into waiting landing craft. Behind them, an entirely different kind of operation was unfolding, one that no German commander had believed possible, and one that would demonstrate American industrial capacity in a way that statistics and technical reports could never achieve. Within the first hour of the Omaha Beach landings, more than 50 M4A1 Sherman tanks would be transported across open water, offloaded onto a hostile beach under fire, and committed to combat operations. For German observers watching from defensive positions, this single fact, this demonstration of logistical audacity that seemed almost insane in its ambition, would carry implications far beyond immediate tactical concerns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The context necessary to understand German shock requires understanding what German military doctrine had assumed about amphibious assault. German strategic planning had been built on the conviction that any Allied invasion would be fundamentally constrained by the practical limits of amphibious operations. Tanks required specialized landing craft to transport them across open water. These craft were vulnerable to German shore defenses. They moved slowly. They required careful coordination. This meant that tanks arriving on the beach would come in limited numbers, trickled in over hours, perhaps arriving in regimental strength by mid-morning if operations went well. German defensive doctrine, therefore, assumed that armor superiority in the opening hours would belong to German forces. Panzers and Sturmgeschütze stationed inland would be rushed forward to counterattack before American tanks could be established in strength. This counterattack would throw the invasion back into the sea before sufficient American armor could arrive to establish a lodgment. The plan was logical based on accepted understanding of amphibious operations. It was also catastrophically wrong. American planners had developed specialized landing craft for armor that German intelligence had severely underestimated. The most significant was the LCM, the landing craft mechanized, a flat-bottomed vessel measuring 110 feet in length, capable of transporting one fully armed tank with crew across open water. By June 6, 1944, American amphibious assault operations had achieved a scale and sophistication that German observers had not believed possible. The United States had constructed over 20,000 specialized landing craft of various types. The LCM alone numbered over 3,000 vessels. These craft had been fitted with sophisticated ramps that lowered mechanically, allowing tanks to drive directly off the craft onto the beach in organized fashion. American naval engineers had developed procedures allowing tanks to cross the open water with minimal waterproofing modifications, a technique that increased speed and ease of deployment compared to earlier methods. The actual offloading at Omaha Beach proceeded with a coordination that reflected months of planning and rehearsal. Waves of landing craft approached the beach in carefully timed intervals. Each craft carried one or two tanks. The ramps descended, the tanks drove onto the beach. Within minutes, the craft reversed away from the beach, returning to the transport ships to retrieve another tank. The process repeated continuously through the morning hours. American naval gunfire support from offshore battleships and cruisers, combined with tactical air support from fighter bombers, suppressed German defensive fire sufficiently to allow this operation to proceed despite enemy opposition. German shore batteries that might have devastated stationary landing craft found themselves unable to achieve decisive effect against targets that spent minimal time in concentrated positions. By 900 hours, more than 75 Sherman tanks had been landed at Omaha Beach and committed to combat operations against German positions inland. By midday, the count exceeded 200. The psychological impact on German commanders observing this assault was immediate and profound. Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm Wiebig, commander of the 901st Regiment of the German 901st Anti-Tank Battalion, positioned in fortified positions overlooking Omaha, later provided a detailed account of what he witnessed during the morning hours. His post-war testimony provides remarkable insight into how German professional soldiers perceived American capability as it was demonstrated in real time. Viebig documented that German observers had been expecting a gradual build-up of American armor over the course of several hours, perhaps reaching strength sufficient for American forces to consolidate their beachhead by late afternoon. Instead, he witnessed a continuous stream of landing craft, delivering tanks at rates that seemed to violate the physical laws of amphibious warfare. Viebig wrote that he had observed perhaps a dozen tanks land within the first 30 minutes, which he considered substantial but manageable given available German anti-tank resources. Then, as the morning progressed and waves of landing craft continued to arrive on schedule, the reality became clear that this was not a trickle of reinforcements, but an organized, systematic deployment of armored strength at scale he had never imagined possible. By 1000 hours, he calculated more than 50 tanks were actively engaged in combat operations. By noon, the count had exceeded 100. German commanders, who had assumed they possessed armor advantage in the opening hours of the invasion, discovered that this assumption had been shattered by American logistical achievement. German panzers and Sturmgeschütze, attempting to execute planned counterattacks, found themselves engaging overwhelming numbers of Sherman tanks that seemed to multiply faster than they could be destroyed. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. These were professional soldiers, accustomed to deploying armor in traditional formations across European terrain. They had experience from North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front. They understood the mathematics of armored warfare at a level that most officers never grasped. What they had never experienced was an enemy capable of landing armor at amphibious assault rates that violated their understanding of what amphibious operations could achieve. Hauptsturmführer Karl Rehn, a company commander in the 22nd Panzer Grenadier Division, later described the shock of realizing that American amphibious assault capability had transformed the strategic situation instantaneously. American landing craft had delivered armor at rates that suggested unlimited capacity. If they could land 50 tanks in the first hour, 200 in the first 3 hours, what was to prevent them from landing 500 by evening or 1,000 by the next morning? Wren wrote that senior commanders immediately recognized the invasion could not be defeated through counterattack, because American logistics appeared to have solved the fundamental problem of amphibious assault. Armor could be landed on hostile beaches at rates that exceeded even optimistic German estimates of what modern industrial capacity could achieve. Every assumption about invasion defense had been predicated on the belief that armor arrival would be constrained by the practical limits of landing craft capacity and the vulnerability of amphibious operations to shore defenses. Those assumptions had been shattered in a few hours by the demonstrated ability of American forces to land armor continuously, despite German defensive fire, despite the logistical complexity, and despite the inherent difficulties of amphibious assault operations. The significance of what had occurred at Omaha Beach extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German commanders recognized that they were witnessing the practical demonstration of American industrial capacity applied to military operations. If American shipyards could produce enough specialized landing craft to deploy armor at assault rates, if American logistics could support continuous offloading operations under fire, if American training had developed procedures allowing rapid deployment of armor across open water, then German defensive planning based on constrained amphibious assault capability had become obsolete. The very concept of defending against amphibious assault through armor advantage in the opening hours had been rendered impossible by American demonstration of logistical capability that violated what German military doctrine had assumed. This realization spread rapidly through German commands as reports from frontline observers reached headquarters. Within hours of the initial landings, German operational staff were reassessing strategic options based on the demonstrated capacity of American forces to land armor at unprecedented rates. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German Army Group B, was in direct communication with forward observers at Omaha Beach during the morning hours. The reports he received documented the continuous stream of tanks being landed and committed to combat. Rommel understood the implications immediately. In his evening situation report to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in France, Rommel made an assessment that would be echoed by numerous German commanders over the following weeks and months. American logistical capacity has exceeded our planning assumptions by orders of magnitude. They are landing armor at rates we cannot counter. The invasion cannot be defeated by counterattack, because American amphibious operations have solved problems we assumed were insoluble. Strategic withdrawal and defense in depth may be the only viable option. Rommel's assessment was correct, though it would take weeks for this conclusion to become universally accepted within German high command. For the German tank crews and commanders directly engaging the American armor being landed at Omaha, the immediate tactical shock was compounded by a second realization that would demoralize them further. The Sherman tanks being landed were not isolated examples, but represented one component of an enormous amphibious assault force. Behind the armor came endless waves of infantry, carried in smaller landing craft. Behind the infantry came support vehicles, artillery, ammunition trucks, and supplies of every type. The sheer scale of the assault overwhelmed German capacity to process the information. German officers accustomed to defensive operations against conventionally supplied forces found themselves facing an assault operation that seemed to violate every principle of military logistics they understood. The continuous arrival of supplies, ammunition, replacement personnel, and reinforcement equipment suggested that American forces possessed capacity to sustain operations at intensity that German forces simply could not match. Lieutenant Hans-Jürgen Schmidt, commanding a company of Peace KPFW 4th tanks positioned near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, provided testimony after the war, describing the escalating shock as the morning progressed. His tanks had engaged American landing craft and knocked out several, creating flaming wrecks on the beach. This initial success created momentary optimism that the invasion could be defeated. Then, as the hours passed and replacement landing craft arrived with reinforcement tanks, Schmidt realized that every tank his company destroyed was replaced by 2 more. American casualties seemed to regenerate. American armor seemed unlimited. Schmidt wrote that by midday, he had come to the terrible realization that they were not fighting an invasion they could defeat, but an industrial machine of such capacity that it would eventually crush all German resistance, regardless of German skill or bravery. The specific moment when this realization crystallized for many German officers came when they observed not just the quantity of American armor being landed, but the rapid development of American supply operations behind the landing beaches. American engineers, working under fire, began organizing supply dumps. American trucks, having been landed themselves, began circulating behind frontline forces, delivering ammunition and fuel. American medical teams established casualty collection points and field hospitals. What German observers witnessed was not just an amphibious assault, but the complete establishment of an operational logistics infrastructure in a matter of hours under combat conditions. This demonstration revealed that American capacity extended not merely to amphibious assault itself, but to the entire complex infrastructure necessary to sustain operations once a beachhead had been established. Oberst Wilhelm Richter, commanding the German 816th Regiment, defending the Omaha sector, attempted to organize a counterattack in the afternoon hours of June 6th with available Panzers and Sturmgeschütze. The attack was poorly coordinated due to disrupted communications from American air attacks and the chaotic tactical situation that developed as American armor established positions inland. German tank crews attempting to execute the attack found themselves under fire from American tanks that had been positioned to cover anticipated German counterattack routes. The ensuing engagement lasted less than an hour. German tanks were destroyed more rapidly than they could inflict casualties. The few surviving German vehicles withdrew, their crews shaken by the intensity of American fire and the realization that they were not facing isolated examples of American armor but organized, coordinated armor deployed at scales they could not counter. The failure of this counterattack had broader implications than the immediate tactical loss. It demonstrated to German commanders throughout the invasion area that their assumptions about defending the beachhead through armor advantage had been rendered obsolete by American logistical achievement. If they could not defeat American armor in direct engagement, and if American armor arrival seemed unlimited, then defense must shift to delaying American advance through other means. Positional defense became the only viable strategy. Counterattack became impossible because armor advantage had been surrendered by American demonstration of amphibious assault capability. German defensive doctrine, which had been built around the assumption of armor advantage in opening invasion hours, had to be completely abandoned within hours of the invasion's beginning. This tactical transformation, forced by American demonstration of logistical capability, had profound strategic implications. Without the prospect of defeating the invasion through armor counterattack, German planners had to accept that the invasion would succeed in establishing a beachhead. The only remaining question became how effectively German forces could slow the American advance and inflict sufficient casualties to make continuation of the war seem politically disadvantageous to the Allies. This fundamentally different calculation drove German strategy for the remainder of the invasion period. The technical specifications of American landing operations demonstrated the underlying engineering sophistication that had enabled this logistical achievement. The LCM landing craft had been designed by American engineers and developed through iterative improvements based on practical experience in amphibious operations in the Pacific. Each craft could transport either one medium tank or one light tank with crew. The forward ramp lowered mechanically in approximately 3 minutes, allowing the tank to drive off onto the beach and immediately engage combat operations. Waterproofing procedures allowed tanks to traverse water depths exceeding that required by the landing craft, enabling deployment in depths where landing craft could not approach the beach itself. American drivers, trained through multiple rehearsals, could execute this procedure rapidly, allowing continuous offloading operations that German observers found incomprehensible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The logistical calculations necessary to sustain amphibious operations at the demonstrated scale required coordination of resources on an unprecedented scale. American planners had calculated that each Sherman tank landed would require specific tonnage of ammunition daily for sustained combat operations. They had calculated fuel consumption under various combat conditions and planned offloading of fuel sufficient to maintain operations. They had anticipated casualty rates and planned medical supply accordingly. This planning, executed through dedicated supply officers and logistics coordinators, resulted in the systematic delivery of supplies that German observers recognized as fundamentally different from German approaches. Where German logistics operated through centralized depots and required coordination through complex command structure, American logistics operated through distributed supply caches positioned close to frontline forces. American supply personnel operated with authority to make immediate decisions about distribution without requiring higher approval. American truck drivers operated with clear priorities understood through rehearsal and training. This distributed approach, which would have been considered too decentralized and risky by German planners accustomed to more centralized control, proved vastly more effective in the chaotic conditions of amphibious assault operations. The German response to American amphibious assault capability evolved over the invasion's first week, as recognition spread through German high command that strategic assumptions had been invalidated. Rommel accelerated efforts to reinforce the Normandy region with additional panzer divisions and assault gun battalions, but he simultaneously recognized that reinforcement could only delay American advance, not prevent it. The numbers simply did not support German counteroffensive capability. German intelligence officers attempted to calculate total American armor available for the Normandy operation, trying to extrapolate from observed landings what total American armor commitment might be. Their calculations suggested that American forces might ultimately concentrate over 1,500 tanks in the beachhead area. German planners calculated that even with maximum reinforcement, German forces could only assemble perhaps 400 to 500 tanks in the region. The arithmetic was devastating. American forces could sustain 2 to 3 times German armor strength while simultaneously landing continuous reinforcements to replace losses. German armor advantage, which had been the foundation of German defensive doctrine, had been surrendered by American demonstration of logistical capacity that violated German assumptions about amphibious assault constraints. The broader implications extended to German understanding of their overall strategic situation. If Americans possessed the capacity to land 50 tanks per hour in an amphibious assault, what did this suggest about American industrial production and logistical capacity in general? If Americans possessed engineering knowledge to develop specialized landing craft and waterproofing procedures for rapid armor deployment, what other capabilities might they possess that German intelligence had underestimated? These questions, debated in German command posts during the first week after D-Day, led to reassessments of American capability that would echo through German strategic planning for the remainder of the war. German planners came to recognize that American industrial capacity was far more extensive and sophisticated than pre-invasion estimates had suggested. This recognition, combined with continuing evidence of American logistical superiority observed through the summer and fall of 1944, would ultimately lead German military leadership to the conclusion that German victory had become impossible regardless of tactical performance. The tanks themselves, the Shermans that had been landed on Omaha Beach in such overwhelming numbers, would serve as constant reminders to German commanders of American capability they could not match. German tank crews that captured disabled Shermans and examined them closely were struck by the same realization that engineers at Kumsdorf testing facility would document through their comprehensive testing program. These American tanks, while individually less heavily armored than German panzers and armed with smaller caliber guns, possessed a reliability and ease of manufacture that revealed fundamentally different design philosophies. A Sherman tank that had been landed across open water at assault rates, that had been driven off a landing craft directly into combat, that had operated continuously for hours under fire without mechanical failure, was telling a story about American automotive engineering and manufacturing capacity that German observers understood with complete clarity. This tank represented what happened when automotive engineers trained in mass production applied their skills to military requirements. It represented the translation of American civilian automotive industry experience into military applications. It represented industrial maturity and manufacturing sophistication that Germany, despite theoretical engineering excellence, had never achieved. For German tank commanders and engineers who had spent careers serving an army that depended on mechanical excellence they could never quite guarantee, the sight of Shermans performing reliably under assault conditions that would have caused German equipment to break down was profoundly demoralizing. The specific moment when this demoralization crystallized for many German officers came during the first week of combat around the beachhead. German companies of panzers that had been expected to defeat American armor had instead found themselves outnumbered, outgunned by superior firepower from American artillery that seemed unlimited in ammunition expenditure, and harassed by American aircraft that had achieved complete air superiority. The accumulated stress of continuous combat against overwhelming odds, against logistically superior enemies whose tanks never seemed to break down, whose ammunition supplies never seemed to run short, and whose reinforcements seemed to arrive on schedule with mechanical regularity, produced a psychological defeat that preceded tactical collapse. German officers in command posts during the evening of the first day recognized what had occurred. The invasion would succeed. The beachhead would be consolidated. American forces would establish themselves in France. German counterattack had failed because American logistical capability had made German assumptions about amphibious assault obsolete. The only remaining question was how effectively German forces could slow the American advance and inflict casualties. For the wider German military, the implication was clear and devastating. If American forces possessed capacity to land armor at assault rates, if American logistical systems could support continuous operations at intensity that exceeded German capacity, if American engineers had solved problems that German military doctrine had assumed were insoluble, then Germany faced a war against an enemy with industrial and logistical capacity that could not be overcome through tactical brilliance or military courage alone. The mathematics were undeniable. American production could replace losses faster than they occurred. American logistics could sustain operations at tempos German forces could not match. American industrial capacity could equip not just one army, but multiple armies with unlimited supplies and reinforcements. This realization, born from witnessing the amphibious assault at Omaha Beach, would gradually permeate German military consciousness through the summer and fall of 1944. The specific shock of seeing 50 Shermans land on a hostile beach in the first hour became symbolic of larger American capabilities that were incomprehensible to German commanders trained in European military traditions. European wars had never been about such scales of material deployment. European warfare had evolved around constraints of production and logistics that limited what armies could accomplish. American capitalism had apparently produced such industrial abundance that these constraints seemed to have been eliminated. The psychological impact on German commanders was profound and lasting. Men who had spent careers as military professionals, who understood logistics and materiel at sophisticated levels, recognized that they were witnessing a transformation in warfare itself. The nation that possessed industrial capacity to land armor continuously across hostile beaches possessed capacity to do things that European military tradition had never contemplated. The war had become a race between German resistance and American production, and American production was demonstrating its advantages at every point of contact. The tanks landed at Omaha Beach did not win the war themselves, but their arrival at assault rates, their continuous performance under combat conditions, their replacement by new arrivals as losses occurred, communicated a message about American capability that German commanders understood with complete clarity. We have already lost. This war cannot be won through tactics or courage. It can only be lost or won through industrial capacity, and America's industrial capacity is so overwhelming that our industrial capacity cannot compete. The German tankers who cursed this madness of American amphibious capability were articulating a truth that German military leadership would gradually accept through the following months. American logistical superiority, demonstrated tangibly at Omaha Beach through the continuous arrival of tanks at assault rates, was the most decisive factor in the war's eventual outcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.